Nectar 3 has a powerful delay module that's great to add a thickening kind of effect and add a sense of space to a vocal, either instead of or in addition to reverb. Now, I'm going to call it up here, and the decision you need to make, and of course you can keep adjusting this freely as you experiment, is where you want to put the delay in the signal flow. I like putting it, at least for the song we're going to work on, before the reverb so that the thickening and additional notes that are generated are going to be fed into the reverb. Now, the basic idea with delay modules is that you add repeats of the signal that's coming in. And in this case, we have it on a stereo track, so we see separate controls for the left side and the right side. If you're working on a mono track, there'll just be one set of these controls. So we set the interval of time at which we want the repeats to be generated, and then the feedback knob determines how much of that signal gets fed back in to the input signal. We have a saturation area here, which is great for adding kind of thickened distortion to the delays that are generated. And we've got 5 different models, and they get progressively more aggressive. The digital is very clean. We get a tape type of saturation, and they get more aggressive. And the echo kind of adds a brighter filtering when it's filtering off more to low end and emphasizes the highs more. And we have a modulation section, which is simple but effective. And what this does is the repeats that are generated can be modulated with an LFO. We turn this on or off separately here, and we can determine the speed that we want the oscillation of the pitch to happen, and then the depth, how deeply we want it to oscillate. We have some filtering in place that's very useful, and this applies to the repeats that are generated only, so it leaves the input signal alone. And as with the metering we've seen in the other modules, we see the amplitude on the side and the frequencies on the bottom, and the process signal will be in a lighter gray with a white border, and the darker border is the input signal. We can optionally link the left and right sides together so that they move together, or when this is unlinked, we can adjust them separately. And this will allow the delay rate to be set to musical tempo based on the tempo of your project, and the dot is dotted notes and the T means triplet. And when it's off, we get a freely adjustable value in milliseconds. So let me start putting this to work on the vocal we have here. And the mix knob plays an important role here in blending in, and I'm going to leave it up kind of high right now so we can really focus in on what it's doing.
Something found as I'm taking my turn, and I'm traveling inside.
So that's a good starting point for a simple delay where each side is doing the same thing. I'm going to solo it so we can really hear it in isolation, and I'll put this up so we're hearing only what this is generating.
So is it something I learned?
Now we're only getting one repeat generated, and if I mix it, we'll hear just the one repeat.
So is it something I learned?
And as I dial up the feedback, we'll get more of the repeats fed back in.
So is it something I learned? Something found as I'm taking.
Let's add some of the saturation, and I'm going to start with the cleanest one.
So is it something I learned? Something found out.
I don't like what that's doing to it.
So is it something I learned? Something found.
It sounds smoother on this particular vocal.
So is it something I learned?
Definitely more aggressive.
So is it something I learned?
Distorted but smooth.
So is it something I learned?
Definitely emphasizes things. And when we add in the modulation, we'll hear, especially on the long notes, an oscillation in the pitch. And I'll exaggerate it a bit so we can really hear what it's doing.
So is it something I learned?
Kind of vibrato, but a little slow goes a long way. So a nice slow rate and not too deep can add a nice texture.
So is it something I learned? Something found as I'm taking my
And let's unlink the sides.
And I'm driving inside this hurricane.
We'll just dial a bit up.
The lightning burns streaks through my bones. So alone. Something found as I'm
So it adds a really nice texture that helps the vocal sit in the mix by giving it a sense of space and blending in better. Now, I've saved a couple of presets that I like based on what we've done here. Let's start with the first one. And what I've done here is I've used some filtering so that we're getting a much thinner iteration of the repeats. And let's listen to this.
So is it something I learned? Something found as I'm taking my turn. And now I'm driving inside.
So I've got very little feedback. I've got a dotted 16th note here and an 8th, which is what I think I had just a moment ago. Some of the analog saturation, and again, a very slow modulation rate, and just a little bit of it dialed in, and it adds a lot. And I've added a compressor afterwards to help kind of glue the whole thing together before it reaches the reverb.
So is it something I learned? Something found out.
It just tames the delays a bit more and helps them fit in. And let's look at the other preset I did, which is a different approach. What I did here was I did very tight delays, and these are set to milliseconds, so that's 43 milliseconds on that side and 22 on this one, almost double the amount. A little bit more feedback, a little bit more aggressive saturation, and much more aggressive in the modulation and more mix. But because these aren't specific rhythmic values, we're not hearing them as distinctly, so we can get a bit more of them in there.
So is it something I learned?
Here's with it more.
Something found as I'm taking my turn.
So when they're soloed on their own, you really hear the distortion, but blended in, they'll add a nice thickening.
So is it something I learned? Something found as I'm taking my turn.
I find they add almost a kind of a dulling effect, and it's not only because of the EQ here, it's just the nature of how they're blending in with this distortion or saturation that makes it a bit darker sounding, and I think it helps it sit in the whole mix better.
So is it something I learned? Something found as I'm taking my turn. And now I'm driving inside.
So it really changes the sense of space. It pushes it in the back a little more. And I've got the same compression here, and we're feeding into the same reverb. So delay is really used not just to generate repeats, but to affect the sense of space that the vocal sits in the mix. I'll see you for more in the next video.